I have been a fan of your work for a long time, and I just read your latest book, The Superhumanities, and I was absolutely blown away by it on a number of fronts. But let's first start with, how do you describe your life's work? You're an author. You've written a number of books on a lot of really fascinating subjects. But how do you define your own pursuits?
So I've never been asked that question to begin with. So thank you for that. A few years ago in 2017, I wrote a big memoir / manifesto called Secret Body. And the subtitle is Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. The reason I'm not plugging this book, James. The
It's okay
reason
to do that.
Yeah, no, the reason I'm mentioning it is I tried to answer that question in the book because I had written all these books, a lot of books, and whenever I would go to a lecture venue, someone would treat me as if I was the author of this one book, and it was always a different book. And I was like, you know what? Nobody's going to read all these books. I better write one book in which I actually tell people what I think this whole thing is about.
Yeah.
And so this whole thing is what I call Secret Body, or the sort of subtext behind all of the texts, all the books. And I think that subtext is that our lives are much more than we think they are. And sometimes that manifests in erotic or gendered or sexual ways. People have transcendent experiences in and around sexual arousal, believe it or not. And sometimes that manifests in sort of uncanny or occult or paranormal ways, like in a near-death experience or a car accident or a precognitive dream or something. And so the basic idea, I think, of the whole work, and particularly this last book, is that human beings are really superhuman beings. And by that, I don't mean James or Jeff. I mean whatever is within James or Jeff, or something behind us or outside us. I don't know what the right metaphor is. There's something more, to use a Jamesian language, that I've been trying to point toward, really, I think, for my whole professional life.
William James.
Yeah, William James. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I found this current book so fascinating is I am a product of the humanities. I went to a state college in California, Humboldt State University, and I went there with an intent to study literature and to learn how to write well. And I was confronted with all of the things that you mentioned in this book. And what I really appreciate what you do in the book is that you demonstrate that that's not enough, and you talk about a lot of different ways that, various, even some of the critical thinkers that we all cite, broke out of that mold, which I think is fascinating. And then also, but you say there's value in it. It's like, it's not an either or proposition. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I was wondering if, you could talk a little bit about that. Especially, you mentioned how some of these issues are at root in broader societal problems that we're having. Could you talk a little bit about how you think that sort of intellectual paradigm has caused some of the social ills that we see in other ways, and what we can do about it?
So I work in the dean's office in the School of Humanities, and I work with humanists every single day. And by humanists, I don't mean philosophical humanists. I mean people who work in the humanities. So people who study literature or art, history, or English, or religion, or whatever it is they study. They're studying the products of human beings, and they're generally using what we think of as critical theory. So they're analyzing these human expressions in terms of class, gender, sexuality, and race. Those are the big ones. But they're also now extending that critique into environmental concerns, into sort of really big concerns that are just literally blowing up or storming all around us. And what I think we do best in the humanities is we explain these power dynamics, or these really bad moralities that lie underneath or behind what people think of as literature or religion or politics or history or whatever it is. The reason I wrote this book is, and by the way, I spent most of my career doing exactly that. I was sort of the poster boy for the psychoanalytic thinker who was always locating gender and sexuality behind and beneath religious expressions. And I still think that, James. I have no doubts there. But I began to worry that intellectuals were being seen as just naysayers. They were just essentially pointing out what's wrong with everything. And of course, what's wrong with everything is really wrong with everything. They were absolutely correct about all of these critical theories, but I began to worry that the public, and by the public I mean largely the public that's not educated in colleges and universities, was not going to hear this and was only going to hear no. They were not going to hear yes. And certainly what got me into the humanities was both the no and the yes. I was really interested in the no because I thought that what my own religious tradition, in this case Roman Catholicism, did with things like gender and male and female sexuality was really quite destructive. So there were lots of no's I wanted to utter, but I also believed that there was something transcendent or spiritual about the human being, and I wanted to say yes to that. And I think what the public hears today from intellectuals is only no.
Yeah.
We've become the big bummer. And what I'm really saying in this book is please don't stop saying no. That's your prophetic voice. That is correct. That is what we are here to do. But a lot of the people we read and study in our classrooms, in fact, also said yes to things. And they also had altered states of consciousness through psychedelics or mystical experience or whatever these instances were. And they thought out of those. A lot of their thinking is out of these essentially these superhuman or non-human states. And so I'm simply trying to hold these two things in balance. And I'm saying, look, you've got to do both. And once we can do both, we can still be the prophets of society, but we can also be listened to because now we're talking about something that people can actually hear too.
Yeah.
So that's essentially the argument, James. I apologize for being the professor there, but I actually am a professor.
No, that's good.
It's what I do. Yeah.
It's true to type, right?
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about Nietzsche and his yes sayings and no sayings, which I think is kind of what you're trying to capture that, with what you're saying now. And I think your book does a fantastic job of developing the character of Nietzsche and saying he's not what everyone thinks he is. And I mean, I am guilty of having not read deeply, all my Nietzsche, but I think it's fascinating how you complicated his character and showed that the Übermensch isn't necessarily what we all thought it was or what we've tagged it as we worry about fascism and all these other things. It's like there's a lot of currents of thought that are, that's problematic, but the way that you explain it, that's not necessarily the case. And, the other thing that I think your book does is that it tries to restore this mystical, and this is your broader work too. I mean, Supernatural with Whitley Strieber, it was the last book of yours I read, and it talks about sort of normalizing the idea that there is something else in the universe and that there's a deeper layer. And it seems like, I mean, not to define your own work, but it seems like you introduce the fact that there is this element to nature, and then now you're trying to almost make it okay that academics once again recognize that truth. But I mean, are academics going to be open to that?
Well, the answer to that is it depends, right? So I have a lot of experience here. I've been talking about these things for almost 20 years now. And when I go and lecture at universities and when I talk to other academics, what I discover over and over and over again is that they're basically in the closet. They actually are not against this. They understand really very keenly that these strange things happen all the time, but they don't want to talk about them. They don't want to step out of the closet because they are afraid, I think rightfully so, that they'll get they'll get labeled as a dilettante or as, a simple believer, even though they're not. And my experience lecturing is, the colleague always takes me aside after the lecture, and she asks me, or he asks me, or they ask me, can I tell you a story? And I always know, I always know what's happening. I never know what the story is, but I know it's going to be wild and crazy. And I know it's also a true story. So what I've learned over the years is that academics are people too, James. They're human beings. And because they're human beings, they're also superhuman beings. And these things happen to them, or they happen to their loved ones, or they happen to their whoever. And so I honestly haven't gotten a lot of pushback, because what academics or intellectuals hear is they hear me trying to make sense of these things through the ideas they learned and that they know. And so like, oh, Jeff's trying to use Derrida or Foucault or Freud or Nietzsche, whoever it is, to understand X, Y, and Z. Like, okay, well, I'm glad he's doing it, because I'm not going to do that. It's that kind of thing. So I've learned to play the fool and to just go in and just do it. And
Yeah.
but I have to say, I don't get a lot of pushback. I actually get a lot of love from my academic colleagues, whom I also really am very fond of. So I don't I don't feel this conflict.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, your arguments are brilliantly fleshed out, so I don't imagine that there would be a whole lot of engagement in terms of pushing back on something that's so well argued. But maybe that's just me. Um,
I mean, people, I mean, generally, when you get an argument that's coherent and cogent, that's a form of respect. It's the people who just simply ignore it or brush it off with a rhetorical hand wave that just you can't really deal with that, because it's not an engagement. It's not an honest listening. It's simply a rhetorical hand wave.
Yeah, the problem with the way that society has handled, I mean, I don't even know, I've been shorthanding it with the phenomenon, right? I mean, because you're talking about a lot of different things, but things that are non-material, I guess, is the way to think about it. But that hand waving, that knee-jerk like dismission or dismissal of it's not possible, so it didn't happen, is it's everywhere, and it has to do with all levels of the phenomenon. And basically, people want to define it that way so they don't have to wrestle with it. They don't have to change their worldviews. How do we break through that? I mean, like, your book is a great argument, but if people aren't picking it up voluntarily, they're maybe not going to hear that message. So how do we start a system where, like, we encourage scientists, for instance, to look at some of the things that are have been studied with ESP, and that the statistics, meta-analysis of statistics has shown that there actually is an effect in a lot of these experiments, but they don't want to believe that. How do we break that open?
This is going to sound naive, but we just do it. I mean, people just need to step out of their closets. And by people, I mean professionals who inhabit institutions and universities and colleges that have some degree of authority in the culture. And they need to step out and they need to start talking about these things in a kind of rigorous and open-ended fashion. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with scientists and engineers and medical professionals, and what strikes me about them is often, they will step out of the closet, but they won't do it till they're retired. And I'm like, no, wait a minute. I mean, okay, that's good. Okay, that's better than nothing, but you actually needed to do that before you retire, because you have to impact and challenge the field or the discipline. We have to get this into our medical schools and our colleges or universities, and maybe even someday in our high schools, believe it or not. I mean, that would be a transformative. Um,
Absolutely.
so I'm not sure. I don't have an easy answer for you, James. I don't think there's one solution to that, but I do honestly believe that people have these experiences and their loved ones do, and that we can talk about them. And one of the answer in my head to your question, which I almost blurted out, was just through their children. And by that I mean, people love their children, you know. So let's listen to their stories, you know. And I don't necessarily mean a 5-year-old. I mean just a 25-year-old, you know, just somebody who's experienced something entirely anomalous. And by the way, that's why I call them impossible, is because they're not possible in our present cultural framework.
Yeah,
Of course, they happen all the time.
exactly.
So clearly they're possible, but they're intellectually impossible. So people wave their hands and say they didn't happen, which is just nonsense,
Yeah.
frankly.
I mean, I kind of imagined you being besieged by people's, paranormal experiences, whether it's alien abduction or having seen an apparition or, the gamut. And in the book, you mentioned that, from your own expertise, you like to analyze those things from a religious frame of reference because that's where where you've built up a lot of your experience and, knowledge. But I mean, do you think does that make this problem of lack of acceptance more difficult, or does that help people get at the issue more? I mean, because sometimes people, when they hear religion or spirituality, their guard goes up thinking that this person is immediately going to proselytize toward me. But if we approach it from a different angle, maybe their hackles don't go up so quickly. What do you think about
It's a problem.
that?
I know I don't want to deny that. And when you say I approach these from a religious angle, I hope you don't mean from a particular religious
No,
doctrinal angle.
no, no, of course
What
not. But I
I
mean,
think what you
yeah,
mean is, well, I'll tell you what I mean, and then you can say
yeah,
what you mean. The reason I think religion is so important here is that historically, human individuals and communities have framed these events religiously, and that these are actually the experiential origins or the reasons for basic religious beliefs like the soul or immortality or even God. So there is definitely a connection between these impossible experiences and basic religious beliefs. Now, having said that, I'll say two other things. Today, people do not always interpret these things in religious terms, which I think is totally fine, as long as they say they happened, you know. Um, and I also know that religious traditions often don't like these experiences at all
sure,
because they do not follow the rules of whatever the religious system is. So these kinds of experiences are not only offensive and transgressive toward a kind of scientific materialism, which is another interpretation, by the way, but they're also transgressive and and heterodox to these religious traditions. So they get whacked on both sides, is what I'm trying to say. They get whacked by the secular materialists and they get whacked by the religious believers. And I'm just saying, look, I don't, if you're whacking them, but that doesn't help. And these things are going to happen regardless of how often you whack them. They're just going to appear somewhere else, like entertainment or graphic novels or television or film now. That's where they've gone in our own culture, by the way.
yeah. Well, I appreciate that you mentioned that in the book, and you could talk about your poster.
Yeah.
That how that feeds into the idea, but the idea of constructing a sort of a new mythology and how that's reflected in comic book characters or movie characters and whatnot. I've been recently reading my first comic book I've ever read, actually, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. Have you read that, or have you familiar? Yeah, I'm on volume 2, so I'm only just now getting my feet wet. But it's fascinating how he ties all of the spiritual quest, sort of initiation, magic, all that into the cells of a comic book.
Look over my head there. There's a poster of a book I wrote called Mutants and Mystics,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it actually begins with Grant Morrison.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and actually it begins with The Invisibles.
Oh well.
Yeah. So
So
you've
I'll
got,
pretend I read it, and that's why I
yeah.
mentioned
So there's I
it.
just pitched another book. But the reason that what that book is about, and the reason this is relevant, is a lot of Grant Morrison's comic book or graphic novel writing came out of his mystical or paranormal experiences. They're fiction, but they're not fiction. And this was kind of one of his basic points, is that there's something about creativity and myth making that very much relies on these altered states of consciousness and body.
Yeah, and it makes it, for me at least, it makes it approachable and dramatic and something that's, interesting and entertaining to read, while at the same time implanting me with a lot of really cool ideas that allow me to conceptualize the issues in a much, I don't know, more interesting way. So now, you're sort of affiliated with a lot of folks who are on the edge of researching these things. We talked about Whitley Strieber and whatnot. Would you consider yourself a part of what Jacques Vallée has called the Invisible College?
Well,
You're not invisible, though.
I hope so. Yeah. So the Invisible College is a phrase that mostly English scientists used in the 17th century.
Yeah.
And the reason they used it, well, there was no such thing as science, by the way, then that was coined later. But the reason they called themselves the Invisible College is they were a collection of intellectuals basically looking at things and asking questions that they knew would get persecuted or punished if it got out. Today, Jacques argued in a book in 1975 that there was a network of intellectuals and scientists looking at the UFO phenomenon, and that they constituted an invisible college because they didn't want to make public their interest in this phenomenon. So it really worked there. I certainly know a lot of people working in these areas, but I don't want to be in an invisible college, James. I want the college to be visible. I mean, this is the whole, I'm not criticizing in any sense what Jacques was doing in 75 or what the British were doing in 1615 or 1620 or whatever it was. I'm simply saying that what we need to do now is mainstream this stuff in the gut of the academy, and we need to make the invisible visible. We need to speak these secrets out loud. And the reason we need to do that is we're just getting the crap beat out of us, because we're only talking about critical and deconstructive things. We're not talking about positive, ecstatic, and even parapsychological things. So I think that there's a strategy here. Do I belong to an invisible college? Maybe. I mean, there are people I know who probably don't want to be named, but is it really invisible? I hope not. I don't want to be invisible.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think that's what maybe Grant Morrison was getting at with the Invisibles, right? I mean,
right.
I think he was drawing on this same kind of history that, historically, James, people were invisible or involved in esoteric communities for good reason. They were politically or socially smart ways of surviving. Okay, so maybe that's partly what we need today, but we also need the opposite. We need to push this into the public and get it talked about on a much broader level.
Yeah. What is your argument to someone who is, that you may be associated with, or just in general, who worries about the ding on their credibility? I mean, as much as, you recognize that these are worthwhile research topics, some people might worry, well, I may not get that grant in 10 years when I really want to study something that, pops up. How do you argue that, maybe it's worth the short-term hit to your reputation in order to further science?
First of all, you may not get that grant. I think that's very likely. And I train PhD students all the time, and they want to come here and study basically this. And I tell them they can't, that they need to learn the field. They need to be able to talk about something that the academy and the market can recognize, and they can do that other thing inside that. And then, at least in the academy, once they're established, then they can come out of the closet, as it were, and do that. So I do think we have to be politically and intellectually wise about this. I just think we're being too wise and too savvy, too careful. I want us to be a little more, we're too risk adverse. I want us to take more chances and to be and understand that it's okay to make mistakes. By the way, as I often say, look, I know I've gone down rabbit holes that aren't even rabbit holes, and people have told me things that never happened. I understand that. I'm okay with being tricked, though, because that's just part of the landscape. And I think the larger picture is that if we jump in and we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, and sometimes we make mistakes, let's be compassionate with each other. Let's be okay with that. That's part of being smart, is to make mistakes and to change one's course. I think that's the answer. This notion of being so careful you don't say anything or do anything, I it's backed us into frankly into a closet, and we're gonna we're gonna suffer for this, I think, as a broader intellectual
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I've read in several books, and I think maybe you can speak to this as well, is that if the public was aware of how prevalent these experiences are, especially among really, really bright people who are on the very cutting edge of science and medical devices, and basically a whole range of things, they would be shocked about how often this happens. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, how prevalent is it?
Oh, people ask me that all the time. Is it getting more prevalent? That's usually how they ask it. Are we evolving, towards
So
some
yeah, I have that question here too, in a way.
yes, are we evolving towards some kind of super normality or something? And my
What is it?
answer is always, how would we know? I mean, to me, the level of rarity and experience here is not a function of the experience itself. It's the function of the social network that allows you to talk about that. And I would take that even further. When the social network is so suppressive and so denying of these experiences, they happen less often. I mean, we are shaped and defined by our social surround, for better and for worse. And so the lack of these experiences is also a paranormal effect of culture, James, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Anti-psi is psi, to speak in parapsychological terms. Um, the other thing I would say is that when you talk to people about this, and I do, by the way, all the time, what you learn very fairly quickly is this is one of the most important things that ever happened to them. These are not tangential experiences. And they often come at moments of crisis or creativity or both. And so I think if we're going to really understand why particular human beings are super creative, or why particular human beings have these experiences and others don't, we've really got to look at things like trauma and crisis and illness, and see this in a much bigger light. I think we tend to just focus on the we reduce things. We reduce the anomalous to the illness. We reduce the near-death experience to the heart attack. We reduce, and then the human being becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until we're just, we're puny, to use a Nietzschean term. There's just nothing to us anymore.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm objecting to, is that basic making the human puny.
That's one of the questions that you mentioned there, is that, are we evolving? But then also, what are we evolving into? I mean, it seems like you repeatedly make that point in the book about how a lot of these things are seeming to want to push us toward evolution. Do you have any sense of what you think? I mean, what do you think in your hardest of hearts, I guess?
Yeah, I have a long answer to that. I'll try to keep it short. First of all, I don't know. I mean, that's not a cop out, James. That's honest. I really don't know. I don't know. Certainly we're evolving. Evolution never stops. Any biologist, any good evolutionary biologist tell you evolution never stops. But you could also be going backwards, by the way. You don't have to be going forward. And if you look at these superhuman states and these anomalous events with a big broad canvas again, what you notice is that some thinkers locate these experiences in the past it's sort of essentially at the beginning of human evolution, as and their reappearance in the present as a kind of leftover or a vestigial kind of phenomena. Other people locate these capacities or these states on some future end of the evolutionary pathway. This was Nietzsche, by the way.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is. All I know is that human beings have these altered states of consciousness. They enter these superhuman states, and they'll often say, "Oh, wow, now I know what the end of evolution is because I was there."
Yeah.
But of course, they were there because whatever that state is not evolving. It's outside of space and time altogether. So I do think there's this tension between the sort of immanent world of biology and evolution and this sort of transcendent world that is not even in space or time, much less a biological organism. And it's that tension that I'm trying to get at in the book. And it's that tension that totally escapes materialist scientists, by the way, but also a lot of humanists, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, transcendence is a bad word in the humanities. You don't want to allow it because it does bad things historically, or so the assumption is. And of course, it often does do bad things, but certainly not always. So it's that three-dimensional picture that I'm trying to paint in the book. Uh, the traditional picture of the human and the humanities today is very much a flat land. It's a two-dimensional board where you can only move left and right or forward and backward, and there's no up, to use the flatland language. And I'm trying to say, well, there is up. There's up all the time. You just have to look. You got to look up to counter the movie.